What does it even mean to use the term original text? I'm going to use one book of the New Testament as a particular example, 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is one of the letters written by Paul to his congregation in the city of Corinth, one of the Pauline epistles. It can illustrate well why scholars are reluctant these days to talk about the original text on theoretical grounds. To begin with, we are missing the original. Whatever Paul wrote, we no longer have it. Our earliest copy of 2 Corinthians is a manuscript called P46. It dates from around the year 200. 2 Corinthians was probably written sometime in the 60s, and so we're talking about a manuscript that was 140 years after the original, is our first manuscript of it. And it's not a complete manuscript. Our first complete manuscript of 2 Corinthians does not come until about the year 350. In other words, nearly 300 years of copying, with mistakes being made everywhere along the line before we have the first complete copy. So that's obviously a problem, but it's not the big problem I want to talk about. There are theoretical problems with even imagining what it might mean to call a text the original text of 2 Corinthians for several reasons. First, this first thing it might seem a little picayune and trite to you, but in fact it's actually kind of interesting. We have good evidence that Paul dictated his letters to scribes who wrote down what he said. In other words, he didn't write himself, he dictated. We have solid evidence of this in the New Testament itself. We also have solid evidence from antiquity that when scribes took dictation, they often made mistakes. They misheard a word, somebody in the room coughed, or they didn't hear it right, they weren't paying attention, they wrote something down wrong. Suppose Paul dictated what we're calling 2 Corinthians, and the scribe wrote down wrong words. What is the original text? Is it the words that Paul spoke, or the words that the scribe wrote down? We don't have access to what Paul spoke, just what was written down, but what was written down might have had mistakes in it. Moreover, suppose what happened was what happened frequently in the ancient world, which is that the author looked at the written text once it had been written down and made corrections to it. Then what is the original text? Is the original text what the scribe originally wrote, or is it what Paul corrected? If it's what Paul corrected, then we're in the ironic situation that the later form of the text is being called the original text. And that could have happened a lot. But as I said, you might think that's a kind of a minor matter, and it's not the biggest problem. It's just an interesting problem. There's a bigger problem with respect to Paul writing 2 Corinthians, which is that Paul did not write 2 Corinthians. Paul did not write the letter of 2 Corinthians as it has come to us today. Scholars have long recognized for over a century that 2 Corinthians is made up of at least 2 different letters that have been spliced together. Chapters 10 through 13 do not come from the same letter as chapters 1 through 9. Not only that, there's a large number of scholars in both the United States and in Europe who maintain that 2 Corinthians, in fact, is made up of 5 separate letters that Paul wrote. In other words, Paul wrote 5 letters, and they were put in circulation and were copied and changed. 5 letters. These were circulated and changed until somebody created our 2 Corinthians by taking parts of these 5 letters and cutting them and pasting them together. This is a standard view in scholarship. You will find this taught in every major research university in North America, what I'm telling you now. This is not some kind of crazy idea that a particularly liberal professor at Chapel Hill thinks, although it is that. But it's not just that. This is standard fare in virtually everybody who's a critical scholar agrees with what I've just told you. But what does that mean then? Somebody created the letter some years, maybe a couple of decades after Paul wrote, so that Paul didn't create 2 Corinthians. Paul created up to 5 letters that had been in circulation and probably changed that were then combined into 2 Corinthians with a lot of the stuff cut out and other stuff put together. Then this letter, this amalgam, is put in circulation, and it's changed over time. First, I want him to answer the question that I raised throughout my talk. What does he mean by the original text? For example, of 2 Corinthians.
What do I mean by the original text? I mean the text as it left the hand of the author when it was dispatched to his readers. 2 Corinthians is a particularly difficult problem because it is true that many scholars, probably most scholars, believe that chapters 10 through 13 were added later, but were also written by Paul, and that it was seamed together. But by no means do all scholars hold to that. But either way, it is a difficult problem, and I fully admit that for Bart. But I don't think 2 Corinthians is representative of most of the New Testament books. It's an exceptional book in that respect. The original text, then, is the text as it left the hands of the author. Now, Bart mentioned that sometimes the original scribe who was copying it down for the author may well have made mistakes, and I would agree with that too. I think that the author would have corrected those places because Paul notes, for example, that he signs off on his letters, and if he's signing off on them just like a businessman who's signing off for his administrative assistant who's typed up a letter, he's signing that document to say, this really is authoritative, it really is from me.
Dan thinks that the original text is the text as it's left the hand of the author. So what is the original text of 2 Corinthians? What is the original text of John? Did it have chapter 21 or not, even though all the manuscripts have it? Did it have the prologue or not? What about the two versions of Acts, one 8.5 times longer than the other? Which is the original version? Did Luke originally have chapters 1 and 2? It's in all the manuscripts.
When it comes to things like the ending of John's Gospel, chapter 21, it seems that for a number of the points that Bart is making, not just for John 21, but Mark 16, 2 Corinthians, the book of Acts, it's as if all scholars, all critical scholars, agree on their opinions. But what he means by a critical scholar is somebody who is defined as agreeing with him on these issues. And I think that's a bit circular. Kurt Aland, again, as I said, the man who was the head of the Institute in Münster and the most important German textual critic of the last half of the 20th century, said that as far as the manuscripts reveal, we don't have any evidence that John 21 was detached from the rest of the gospel, or that chapters in the middle of John were transposed in a different direction like Rudolf Bultmann's thought. He was saying we have to start with the manuscript evidence, and that's what we have to do. I think that's epistemologically humble. I agree with Bart on that. But whether John 21 was added to John's gospel or not is a really significant question that has not been settled. And we have a student at Dallas Seminary who is doing his doctoral dissertation on this, and he's gone in various directions on it. And we just want him to pursue the evidence as best he can.
Or the Gospel of Mark. Mark's gospel ends with the women going to the tomb after Jesus has been raised from the dead, seeing a man there who tells them that they're to go to Galilee, tell the disciples to go to Galilee, where Jesus will meet them. But the women flee from the tomb, and they don't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. End of gospel. Many scholars think that the gospel ends too abruptly. You can't end a gospel without Jesus showing up to the disciples after the resurrection, and many scholars think that a page has been lost. If a page has been lost from the end of the gospel, what's the original gospel? If it's the gospel with the original page, we don't have any access to it. If you say it's the gospel without the original page, then you're saying a later form of the gospel is the original gospel, and that hardly makes sense.
Bart mentioned also Mark 16 as an illustration along these lines, that we don't have the original text of the end of Mark's gospel anymore. That may be true. However, it's by no means the only opinion out there, and I would say it's not even the majority opinion. He suggested that perhaps the last leaf of Mark's gospel fell off. That would be true if Mark's gospel were originally, or it could be true, if Mark's gospel were originally written as a codex. That's our modern book that's bound on one side with pages. Most of you have not seen a codex because you only know the scroll on your computer screen. That's older technology. But if Mark's gospel was written on a scroll, as it almost surely was, then that last leaf would be the most protected. It's like turning back your scrolls into the Blockbuster video. You have to rewind the darn thing. That's before everybody's age here, I guess, isn't it? Goes back to VCR times. But Mark 16 would have been written on a scroll, and consequently the last leaf most likely would not have been lost, but I think Mark intended to end it at 16:8. Nevertheless, that's a minor point.
Very quick, final third point, why can't scholars agree? If we can get back to the New Testament reliably, if we can reliably reconstruct the original Greek New Testament, why haven't we? It's not for want of effort. Scholars have massive disagreements on this, that, and the other thing up and down the line, year after year, decade after decade. Scholars can't agree on what the original text is supposed to be. Over the centuries, these disagreements have been very important. They have involved such crucial doctrines as the doctrine of the Trinity, which relates to textual problems. The full divinity of Christ, affected by textual problems. The full humanity of Christ, affected by textual problems. The atoning sacrifice of his death, affected by textual problems. Favorite stories of Jesus' life, affected by textual problems. The proof of the pudding is in the tasting. In the year 2005, there were two scholars who put together an edition of the Greek New Testament, which they claimed was the original New Testament, the original Greek. 5 years later, in the year 2010, another scholar put together an edition of the Greek New Testament. It differed from the 2005 version in nearly 6,000 places. After all the manuscript discoveries we've made, after all the technological developments, after all the methodological developments, after all the research, we have two editions that differ in 6,000 places. And that's only counting the places that are mentioned in the apparatus. No one knows how many times they differ overall. At least the two editors don't, because I asked them yesterday.
Bart also asked, why can't scholars agree? And he said there's two texts that came out in 2005 that both presented the text as original, the original New Testament. They disagree in 6,000 places. Well, I think that's overstated. I think that's terribly overstated. The vast majority of New Testament textual critics are going to agree on the vast majority of textual problems. Bart mentioned that when he in one place that if he and Dr. Metzger were to sit down and discuss what variants they thought were original, which ones were not, he said there'd be probably no greater difference in maybe a couple dozen places. So most scholars are going to agree with the text that we have today, except in at most a few hundred places, not a few thousand places. It's the kind of a group that follows those 9th century and later manuscripts where they see as many as 6,000 differences from the earlier ones.
Some of the worst scribes on record were the earliest scribes. Everybody agrees on this. How good then were the scribes copying text before the worst scribes? That is, what evidence do you have that the earliest scribes were competent at all? It won't do to say that we have a copy of Mark and Matthew and Luke, precisely because Matthew and Luke differ in numerous places when they're citing Mark. I, too, as it turns out, have a doctoral student doing a dissertation on this, and he's finding much more than trivia. They, in fact, were widely different. If some of the worst scribes on record were the earliest scribes, how good were the scribes copying the text before them? That is, what evidence do you have that the earliest scribes were competent at all? Dan asks me, well, how do I know that they were incompetent? I know because we have the quotations of the church fathers that he talked about. We have church fathers from the 2nd century who quote the New Testament all over the map, and in virtually every instance that they quote every instance that you have an author quoting the New Testament, the author has a different text from the text that's come down to us in the manuscripts. He wants to talk about Alexandria. Look at the quotations of the New Testament in Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century. Radically different from the form of the text that came down to us, even in the Alexandrian manuscripts. We know these scribes in the 2nd century were changing the text. And so my question to him is, what is the evidence that he has that the earliest scribes are competent at all? How do we know that our earliest surviving manuscripts were based on highly accurate copies instead of truly awful ones that were full of accidental and intentional changes? What is the evidence? How do we know that our earliest surviving manuscripts were based on highly accurate copies instead of truly awful ones that were full of accidental and intentional changes? What is the evidence?
The reason that we have a lot of variants is that we have a lot of manuscripts. It's simple, really. No classical Greek or Latin text has nearly as many variants because they do not have nearly as many manuscripts. If there were only one copy of the New Testament in existence, it would have 0 variants. Today, in Greek alone, we have more than 5,600 manuscripts. Many of these are fragmentary, especially the older ones. But the average Greek New Testament manuscript is over 450 pages long. Altogether, there are more than 2.5 million pages of text, leaving hundreds of witnesses for every book of the New Testament. And Bentley was right. The Greek New Testament of his day has about 5,000 differences from the critically reconstructed Greek New Testament of today. As more and more manuscripts have come to light, we are getting closer and closer to the wording of the original. Because of the early Christians' desire to spread the good news about Jesus' death and resurrection, the New Testament was early on translated into a variety of languages: Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, Gothic, Ethiopic, Armenian, Old Church Slavonic, and a host of others. There are about 10,000 Latin manuscripts of the New Testament alone. No one really knows the total number of these ancient translations, but the best estimates are that there are more than 5,000 plus the 10,000 in Latin. Altogether, including Greek, we have at least 20,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in various languages. How does the average classical author stack up? If we're comparing the same period of time, 300 years after the composition of the book, the average classical author has no literary remains. Not a single manuscript. None. 0. But if we compare all the manuscripts of a particular classical author, regardless of when they were written, the total would still average less than 20, and usually less than a dozen, and they would all be coming much more than 3 centuries later. Stack them up, and they're about 4 feet high. Now, how high would the stack of New Testament manuscripts be? Well, let's take a look. I think that's probably not high enough. Bart, I think, said it went to the ceiling of the auditorium. It certainly would go that high, I believe. That's getting closer. That's better. That's even better. And that's as much as I could do in PowerPoint. There should be 8 times as many New Testament manuscripts as you see here. And you put them in one stack, and they're over a mile high.
What about Dan's comments? He made several points that were, in fact, were points that I stressed. He stressed them a little bit more. He wanted to stress that we have lots and lots of New Testament manuscripts that you could stack them up a mile high. That's absolutely right. He also insisted that we have more text than we have for the classical authors. That's absolutely right. I agree with both points, but they are not really the key point. Most of these manuscripts date from after the 9th century, and they simply don't help us if we want to know what the text was like 800 years earlier. And the irony is that Dan agrees. Dan has written numerous articles arguing that these late manuscripts are not accurate representations of the original text, as he calls it. If we want to know the original text, we need early manuscripts.
Last October, when Bart and I had a debate in Dallas, I said that we have today as many as a dozen manuscripts from the 2nd century, all fragmentary, 64 from the 3rd, and 48 from the 4th. That's a total of 124 manuscripts within 300 years of the composition of the New Testament. Most of these are fragmentary, but collectively, the whole New Testament is found in these manuscripts, and several books are found in them multiple times.
I don't know where Dan is getting the figure of 12 manuscripts from the 2nd century. I have in my hand the official listing put out by the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany. I checked it again last night. They date only 4 manuscripts, definitely going back to the 2nd century. 4. These 4 make up 42 verses altogether. 42 verses out of the nearly 8,000 in the New Testament are what is represented in these 2nd century manuscripts.
This was recognized 300 years ago by the brilliant textual scholar Richard Bentley in his work, Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking. Now, Bentley was commenting on John Mill's work of 1707 that Bart had mentioned, where he discovered the 30,000 variants after collating 100 New Testament manuscripts. And Bentley sees this as a very positive thing for helping us to get back to the original. If there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, then we would have had no various readings at all. And would the text be in a better position then than now that we have 30,000 variant readings? It's good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. Bentley penned those comments in 1713 when only 100 New Testament manuscripts had been examined.
Dan has wanted to argue on several occasions that the fact we have so many variants is a good thing, not a bad thing. I don't buy it. If we wanted to have a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and what we had instead were 5,000 copies, and these 5,000 copies of the Declaration of Independence differed from one another in 400,000 ways, would you seriously think that was better than having 5,000 copies that didn't disagree at all? And it's not necessary for handwritten texts to have this many errors. If you know anything about Jewish copying practices through the Middle Ages, how Jews copied the Hebrew Bible as opposed to Christians copying the New Testament, Jews made sure there were no mistakes and there were not variant readings. We don't need these variant readings. We could do without them. We're not happy we have them because we have to weed through them.
First of all, I want to know if Bart can offer a convincing scenario in which the wording of the original text disappeared without a trace. Kurt Ahlon, Germany's best textual critic in the second half of the 20th century at the University of Münster, which is the epicenter for all New Testament text critical studies, whose institute poured thousands of hours looking over manuscripts, claimed that no reading had ever made it into the manuscripts that had disappeared. Bart is claiming that not only several spurious readings have disappeared, but so has the original wording. The very fact that we have a rather large amount of variant readings in the existing manuscripts is evidence that no one group was able to conform all the manuscripts to their own standard, that no one group was able to suppress the original wording.
Can I come up with a scenario to explain how a text has disappeared without a trace? This is a softball. Look, the Gospel of Mark. Suppose Mark was done in Rome sometime around the year 70. Somebody wrote something that we call the Gospel of Mark. Suppose it was copied twice by scribe A and scribe B. Scribe A was obscure and his copy got lost. Unfortunately, he was a very accurate copier. Copyist B was not a very accurate copier, and he made a lot of mistakes. But he was a well-liked guy, and everybody knew about his copy, and his copy got copied 5 times. And then those 5 copies each got copied 10 times. And then those 50 copies each got copied another 10 times. You've got 500 copies, all going back to B, which was filled with mistakes, and the accurate copy is lost. So it's completely possible that that copy B, has incorporated a mistake that got transferred to all of the surviving copies. So, I mean, it's not hard at all to imagine a scenario where that happened.
If Bart is this skeptical about the New Testament text, how skeptical would he be about the rest of the ancient Greco-Roman literature? I want to know if he thinks that we have no clue what these other authors said.
How skeptical am I about the rest of ancient literature? I'm no more or less skeptical than the scholars who work on that literature. Scholars have long recognized that we simply cannot even talk about an original copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey, like parts of the New Testament, were passed along through the oral tradition. They were passed on orally, and they came down to different authors who wrote different accounts at different times, and what we call Homer was a compilation of different forms of the text. There is no original form of Homer. There may be an earliest attainable text of Homer, which is what we talk about. We don't know exactly what Plato wrote in the Republic. We don't know. How can we know? We don't have the manuscripts. Am I skeptical about that? No, I don't actually consider this to be radical skepticism. I consider it to be epistemological humility. There are some things we know, and there are some things we don't know. Epistemology is the science of knowing what we know. And sometimes we should simply be humble enough to admit that we don't know something. We don't know the original text of Homer or Plato or Aeschylus or Euripides. It's absolutely right, though we can reach the earliest attainable form of those texts.
Old and wrinkly.
When Dr. Wallace says the latter text of the New Testament gained only 2% of material, what is that 2%? Is it only 2% of discrepancy between all those works? And how do you respond that to Dr. Ehrman? So, Dr. Wallace first, what is that 2%?
I'm saying that the later manuscripts add 2% to the what we have for what we would consider to be the earliest text or the original text. And that is seen by looking at what's called the majority text and how long that document is. That is, in most respects, what stands behind the King James Bible. So all of you can get a good sense of the difference between the early manuscripts and the later ones by looking at a modern translation versus the King James Bible. That's where most of these differences are going to show up.
Dan, are you saying that, that it adds 2% in bulk, or are you saying the total difference is 2%?
I'm not sure I understand the difference.
Are you saying it's 2% longer?
It's 2% longer, yes.
But that doesn't mean it's just 2% different.
No, it's not just 2% difference. It's
How
closer
different?
to about 4 or 5% different, I believe.
Yeah, okay.
Some of that is words that are substitutions for others.
Yeah,
most of
right.
it can't be translated.
Yeah, right.
To Dr. Ehrman, what are the gospel manuscript inconsistencies that to you matter a lot?
I'm not sure what this person's asking, because okay, I'll give you I'm not sure if this is answering the person's question, because we aren't talking about inconsistencies in the Gospels when we're talking about the manuscripts. But I will talk about a difference in a Gospel manuscript that makes a big difference. How's that? There's a very interesting passage in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus goes off to the garden after he's arrested, and he begins to pray. And as he prays, he begins to sweat great drops as if of blood, and an angel comes down and ministers to him. This is right before he's arrested, and this is where we get our phrase, sweating blood from this passage in Luke chapter 22, verses 43 and 44. It's a very interesting passage, Jesus in this deep agony, in part because it's not found in any of the other Gospels. It's not in Matthew, Mark, or John. And it's not found in some of our earliest and best manuscripts of Luke. Now, if it's not originally in Luke, then the whole idea of sweating blood was something that a scribe added to the text. And so the question is not here whether a scribe has changed the text. The question is, which direction did the scribe change the text? Did a scribe who found the idea of Jesus sweating blood problematic take those verses out? Or did a scribe who knew the story about Jesus sweating blood think it'd be important to insert them into Luke? Were they taken out or put in? It's either one or the other. One of the reasons I'm interested in this is because my first piece of scholarship in text criticism was actually on these verses, where I argued that, in fact, what's going on here is that scribes have modified the text for theological reasons, and that what they've done is they have inserted the verses into Luke. Because without these verses in Luke, if you just read Luke, okay, if you don't think about what Matthew says or what Mark says or what John says, but if you just focus on what Luke says, there is almost nothing to suggest that Jesus really suffers going to his death. In other words, he's not in agony, he's not in pain. In fact, every indication that he's in agony and pain that Luke got from his predecessor, Mark, Dan and I both agree that Luke probably used Mark, every indication of this, Luke is taken out. So that in Luke, Jesus has what scholars have called a passionless passion, where he doesn't seem to suffer. But scribes found that untenable and stuck these two verses in so that Jesus really does suffer in Luke. It changes the complete tone of the passage, and you could argue the complete tone of the Gospel of Luke, because now Jesus is shown in great agony going to his death. So that would be an example.
Dr. Wallace, how do you respond to the Luke controversy?
Oh, I think I agree with Bart that those verses would add a significantly different picture. And I would add this, that in John's gospel, I see that one as even more passionless than Luke's gospel. John's gospel is the only one that doesn't have the 3 hours of darkness in the garden. John's gospel, like Luke, does not have, my God, why have you forsaken me from the cross? And in John's gospel, the time where Jesus is going to the cross is the time of his glory, not the time of his suffering. And as we look at those things, the question that we really have to ask, and this gets far beyond textual criticism, but it's an area that both Bart and I are very interested in and we work in, is why is it that the Jesus of John looks so different from the Jesus of Mark, for example? Is it because they're talking about a different person? Is it a totally different perspective? Is one a twisted view and the other was accurate? Or is it rather that these authors are giving portraits of Jesus rather than trying to take photographs and trying to be precise, and they're giving an interpretation of him? And I take it that, for example, John's gospel is trying to give a portrait of Jesus to the omniscient reader who knows the end from the beginning, because in the very first verse he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the reader, right from the get-go, knows Jesus is divine. And so he's seeing Jesus through the eyes of somebody who's already been there. It's kind of like Usual Suspects. If you see it the second time, you understand what these innuendos are now that you could not interpret the first time around.
I don't know if this is a what if. So what if questions are always interesting. To Dr. Ehrman, although not the literal originals, if earlier copies of the manuscripts were to be found, let's say within 30 years of the originals, would your perspectives on the matter of textual criticism change?
Oh yeah, they certainly could. I mean, if we discovered a lot of manuscripts from the first century, then things would change quite drastically. They wouldn't change with respect to the theoretical problems of whether we can talk about the original text. But if we had tons and tons of manuscripts from the first century, obviously precisely what we don't know now, we could know then. And while I'm on this, why don't I ask Dan about this first century manuscript you're talking, because it's the first I've heard of it. Could you say something about what its extent is, and who the paleographer is, who's dated it, and whether anybody has corroborated the dating?
I'm afraid I can't tell you those things, and the reason is because this whole project is rather hush-hush right now until the publisher comes out a year from now. I can tell you the publisher is E.J. Brill. And so it's a reputable publisher, and I've been sworn to secrecy on the rest of the data. But yes, the dating has been corroborated.
Okay, I believe you.
But I'm not so sure we need to have tons and tons of these first century manuscripts. The very fact that we have one.
Well, I don't know that we have one. I mean, I haven't seen it.
Okay, let's wait a year. We'll talk about this next February.
Okay, good.
But assuming we have
I mean,
one.
if we have one that's a complete manuscript of the New Testament,
well, that would be
you're going to get my attention then, let me tell you. But if you've got a scrap of a manuscript that's 12 verses long, that's like 12 verses in some 5th century manuscript, that'll be interesting, but it's not going to turn the world on its ear.
I think in terms of these papyri discoveries, it is very significant to find a first century manuscript. And as we debated before, you said, we don't have any evidence. We have no idea what these first century manuscripts look
But we
like.
still, I mean, I don't know how long this manuscript is. I don't know who's dated it, on what grounds he's dated it. I mean, as you know, there have been scholars who have dated manuscripts to the first century before, but when subjected to critical scrutiny, their views have been shown to be wrong, just within the last 10 years. And so
those are quacks, though, the ones you're referring to. I mean, both of us would, they're just...
Well, they're quacks. I mean, yeah, so,
Dr. Wallace, comment on issues of addition in some of the epilogue, prologue confusion that are in some of the books of the New Testament.
One more time on the question.
Yeah, comment on some of the additions and or differences between the epilogue portion or prologue in some of the New Testament
Some of the books meaning John?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there are a number of different opinions on the Johannine epilogue and prologue. And one of them that's very famous is by Raymond Brown, who argued that this book went through 5 different editions. I did some work on this several years ago, and I felt that whether it went through 5 different editions or not, there was one that was finally published. And I saw some evidence, and this got published in the Vatican's official scholarly journal, Biblica, that that latest edition was the only one that was published. John may have been editing it and making changes all along, but only when he got to the place where he published it, that's when we see the full text, which would have included the prologue and I think the epilogue, but I'm not going to die on that hill. I think that was included in John originally.
Dr. Ehrman, can you comment on your views on some scribes willfully manipulating some of the texts, and why do you think that?
Yeah. So it's usually thought among text critics that there are 2 basic kinds of mistakes that you find in the manuscripts. There's some that are just by accident, where a scribe gets sleepy or inattentive or maybe just not very skilled, and he just accidentally makes a mistake. But that there are other places where scribes willingly and knowingly modified the text. And so I got interested in this about 20 years ago. When I was working in the field of text criticism. After I had done my dissertation at Princeton Seminary, I was fishing around for a book to do in this field, and I got interested in this question of scribes intentionally changing their texts. And I ended up writing a book that tried to argue that among the changes in the New Testament, you can find some, dozens probably, maybe over 100. I never counted how many. Dan probably knows because he counts these things. How many did I include? Do you know? No?
I don't remember.
I don't know. I don't know either. But it was over 100. Places where scribes changed the text because of their theological controversies. That scribes were in theological controversies in the 2nd and 3rd centuries over, say, who Christ is, and they altered the text in order to make the text say what they wanted it to mean. And so I gave a large number of instances of where this appears to have happened in our manuscripts. And one of them was this one I was mentioning earlier about Luke chapter 22, where I argued that, in fact, the reason scribes put Jesus sweating blood into the text was to show that he was fully human. That he was fully human, so much so that he was in deep agony sweating blood. And they wanted to emphasize this because there were some Christians who were arguing that Jesus was God, but he's not really a human. And there were other Christians who wanted to stress, no, he really is a human, and that was the motivation for putting those verses in. So,
thank you.